You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Empower your business or digital agency with Bluehost, trusted by over 5 million WordPress users globally. Bluehost features top-to-bottom hosting optimizations designed specifically for WordPress, giving you 24/7 access to a team of experts for support, plus thousands of WordPress help articles. So if you want to streamline WordPress website creation with intuitive controls and premium support, choose Bluehost, powering over 2 million websites worldwide.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first, like you know to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 203, The Fall of France, Falling Apart. This week, a big thank you goes out to Ingo for the donation and to Deb and Thomas for deciding to become members of the podcast. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast's episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. You can head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. All over France, as the German advance continued, confusion reigned supreme. On June 10th, a radio broadcast would announce that the government was leaving the capital, saying, quote, "The government is compelled to leave the capital for imperative military reasons. The prime minister is on his way to the armies," end quote. On the 11th, the city of Paris was declared an open city, causing it to avoid the destruction that so many other major cities in Europe would experience during the war. Wagon and others put the safety of Paris above continued resistance, which meant that while in 1945 places like Warsaw, Berlin, Leningrad, and countless other cities would basically lay in ruin, Paris would remain mostly unharmed. Now, Churchill had advocated for a strong defense of Paris, later writing that, quote, "I emphasize the enormous absorbing power of the house-to-house defense of a great city upon an invading army," end quote. But the French strongly resisted any kind of push for such fighting. I don't really blame them for this hesitation because while urban fighting through Paris would have been very costly in German lives, it also would have caused a tremendous number of French casualties as well. Bloodshed that many French leaders wanted to avoid since they believed the war was already lost. But the loss of the capital would be a serious blow to French morale, and just as importantly, a major boon for German morale, although it's just another in a long list of German victories, which all had kind of the same impact. As a note for longtime listeners, on the day that Paris was taken by the Germans also captured Verdun, the city that had eluded them after so much bloodshed during the First World War. But of course, by the time that Paris was captured, the majority of the sacred battlefields of the First World War were already located within German-controlled territory. Memories of those earlier battles would still be kind of haunting the halls of French power, though, even though it had evacuated Paris. Churchill would try to call back to the spirit of 1918 when meeting with the French, when the German spring offensives had, made it briefly seem like everything was lost in March 1918. But there was a major difference, which Pétain would point out in a discussion with Churchill, and he was the best person in the world to do so, since he was a pivotal part of the story that he told. In 1918, the British Army looked to be on the brink of destruction, and they were only saved by Pétain quickly moving 40 divisions from the French sector of the front to bolster the British defense. He would point this out to Churchill, wondering where the British divisions were to do the same for the French. The answer was that those 40 divisions that the French desperately needed did not exist. And so all the French army could do was to continue to retreat. But it appeared that they could do little else to alter the overall situation, other than maybe seek a way to end the fighting. While many French leaders were moving to the belief that the war was lost and they had to start looking beyond it, on the German side, most of the leadership also understood that the campaign in France was entering its final phase. To coordinate efforts during this time, Hitler would issue Führer Directive 15, which outlined what each of the German armies should do to close out the invasion. In the north, Box Army Group B should simply pursue the retreating French to prevent them from forming any kind of new line of resistance. Essentially, the French in this area were already retreating, and Bach just needed to make sure that did not stop. More importantly, Army Group A under the command of Rundstedt and Army Group C under the command of Lieb would focus on encircling and then destroying the French Second Army Group, which was positioned roughly between Paris and the Maginot Line. This would obviously prevent the French soldiers of that army group from continuing the fight, but would also, and more importantly by this point, prevent more French forces from escaping to southern France and then perhaps to North Africa. There was a very real fear among the German leadership that the French would do precisely what Reynaud was suggesting that they do, which was take as many men and as much material as possible to the French territories in North Africa, and from there to continue to wage war against Germany. Trying to minimize the impact that the French could have if they chose that course of action to continue to resist in North Africa was a major part of why the Germans chose their exact kind of course of action during this period of the campaign. On the French side, the forces at the front did attempt to stage a fighting withdrawal where possible, but often this just appears on the map as kind of a steady retreat. Once their lines on the Somme and the Aisne were broken, and then the lines on the Seine and the Marne had done the same, the French forces began to really suffer from the problems that would plague any retreating army during the Second World War and really throughout history. The retreat tends to kind of gather momentum and inertia that gets harder and harder to arrest and to end. A new challenge presented to the armies during the Second World War was that when they retreated, so much of their equipment that was either hauled by or powered by internal combustion engines began to break down, and it had to be left behind, robbing them of some of their most important equipment and munitions. Even if they did want to try and form a new line of resistance, they would have to do so without all of that equipment that they were forced to leave behind. The French tanks were a major problem in this regard around their breakdown rate, because when an army was retreating, there was no opportunity to fix vehicles. If a tank broke down and required anything other than the most trivial of fixes, it had to be left behind, which meant that it was as good as destroyed, and sometimes worse because the Germans might be able to use it. On the flip side, for the advancing Germans, if one of their tanks broke down, while the loss of fighting power was unfortunate, the tank would often be able to be recovered and then repaired and put back into action. When a retreating tank broke down, it was lost for good. A similar challenge was being faced by the French Air Force, because as the French army retreated, the air forces were put into kind of a displacement cycle as they bounced from airfield to airfield. Any aircraft that was damaged even slightly, anything that prevented it from flying, meant it had to be left behind, and any supplies or equipment that could not be easily moved suffered the same fate, sapping just as much of the strength of the French Air Force as German operations did in the last days of the war, this kind of constantly having to leapfrog from airfield to airfield. The only benefit that air squadrons had is that it was easier for them to flee the country and head to North Africa, which some would do, even before firm orders arrived to do so. One of the interesting events that would occur at this late stage of the campaign is that there would be real assaults on some of the French positions that made up the Maginot Line, as the Germans were trying to push through and surround some of the retreating French forces. Now, next episode, we'll discuss some of the actions of the Maginot Line in more detail, but one of the areas that would see fighting during the period of the retreat was known as the Saar Gap. In this area, south of Saarbrücken, it was fortified differently than most of the areas of the Maginot Line due to a difference in geography. Along most of the Maginot fortifications, everything was anchored on large gros ouvrages, or very large bunkers. And these were truly strong fortifications, lots of concrete, lots of guns, underground, all the good stuff. Places like Ouvrage Hochwald and many others would almost be impervious to German attack, and they would hold out until the very end of the fighting. In some cases, French officers had to be sent to the ouvrages after the armistice to kind of convince them to surrender. That's how well they were doing. They were almost impervious to German attack. But the defenses in the Saar Gap were different due to a combination of general geography and then a higher water table in the area, which made it difficult to build the underground fortifications that made up so much of the Maginot defenses. And so instead, the French defenses were built around smaller fortifications, which required more infantry to man and to defend. Now, since the beginning of the campaign, 2 infantry divisions had been positioned on this sector of the front, but this was reduced, of course, when the general retreat was ordered by General Weygand after the collapse of the defenses on the Seine. But even with this reduction in force, when the German artillery fire began to fall on June 14th, the French defenders were ready. They would be facing the German troops of the First Army, and they had the goal of pushing through the fortified area and surrounding the French forces to the north and to the west. However, when the Germans attacked, after about a 90-minute artillery barrage, they found that the French defenders were still quite capable of inflicting serious casualties, and 5,000 German soldiers would be killed or wounded throughout the 14th of June. The French forces, feeling that they'd done their duty, would spend the next night retreating back 25 kilometers to their final defensive line, with the Germans then advancing into that newly abandoned French territory. But there, the German advance would end, because it was difficult to continue to push forward against an enemy that was resisting, while also being unable to attack to the north and to the south of the Saar Gap, because on both flanks, the ouvrages of the Maginot fortifications resisted German efforts to neutralize them. And so, 25 kilometers into France was as far as the Germans would go in this area, at least for the moment. It was kind of a good showing for the Maginot fortifications, even these lesser ones in the Saar Gap. They were defended by French forces who were still high in morale, still really wanted to kind of mount that defense, and they inflicted serious losses on the Germans, kind of giving an insight into how it may have went on other areas of the Maginot Line had the Germans attacked there.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
For over 50 years, Burlington's legacy has been great deals on coats for all weather conditions. So before you're caught unprepared for the winter weather, head to Burlington for name brands, quality items, and surprising fits for every family member. Stock up on coats, sweaters, and accessories before the cold hits, so you can finally stop avoiding the elements and start living comfortably. Warm up at your nearest Burlington location less than 1 mile away. Burlington. Deals, brands, wow.
When the Germans had invaded Poland in September 1939, and then declarations of war had flown back and forth between Berlin and France and London, a fourth major power, Italy, had very specifically stayed out of the war. Now, Mussolini had clearly informed Hitler that this would be Italy's course of action when Mussolini was informed of the forthcoming invasion of Poland a few days before it happened. And Hitler understood, and really they were kind of planning for a lightning strike into Poland, and then they still kind of hoped not to go to war with Britain and France at the time that Mussolini and Hitler were having this discussion. But then, of course, Britain and France declared war, and Germany was at war with both of them. Then during the Phony War, while everyone was anticipating a German attack into France, Mussolini and the Italians continued their policy of neutrality. The Italians had very good reasons to want to stay out of a war. Most importantly, the fact that the Italian military was far from ready to participate in a major European conflict with the other major powers. After their adventures in Ethiopia and Spain and Albania, the Italian military just needed time to recover and to rebuild. As an example of the level of unpreparedness of the Italian military at this point, in November 1939, Marshal Badoglio would send a report to Mussolini, which stated that Badoglio believed that out of the 63 divisions of the Italian army, or at least the 63 divisions it had on paper, only 10 of them were truly fit and ready for war, and most of the rest were missing critical equipment, training, and in some cases, even uniforms. Now, the Italians did have 2 armored divisions, but they only really existed on paper, and the tanks that they were equipped with were completely inadequate for the European battlefields, even of 1939 and 1940. There was also very little to gain for the Italians when it came to entering the conflict, and so neutrality seemed like the best course of action. But then something somewhat unexpected happened. The Germans, when they attacked France, were very successful, very, very successful, and very quickly. This caused Mussolini to completely reconsider his course of action, because if the Germans were about to win the war, Mussolini needed to be a part of the peace negotiation process. It was only in that position that the Italians could get their share of the spoils, hopefully some juicy territory in North Africa that had previously been controlled by the French. This meant that late in the afternoon of June 10th, just 5 days after the start of Case Red, Italy declared war on France. Mussolini declared war on France. Now, there were a few problems as a result of this declaration, the most important being that the Italian army was not adequately informed, particularly those that were on the border with France, the army that would actually be attacking them. These were the units of Army Group West, which was stationed along the border, and the commanders of its units would only find out that they were at war with France when they heard a broadcast of the speech given by Mussolini where he announced the declaration. Fortunately, there were at least some people in the Italian high command who understood the general situation of the Italian forces on the French front, and Badoglio would tell Mussolini that the Italian army would require 25 days of preparation before any operations could be launched against its northern neighbor. Even this, honestly, was probably too optimistic, but it was far too slow for the situation at hand because Mussolini and everybody else could see that in the days after Case Red, the French were retreating almost everywhere, and if the Italians were going to get anything from the war, they had to do something and do something fast before the French surrendered to the Germans. On the French side of Mussolini's declaration, well, they certainly didn't want to be at war with another country, and the fact that they now had to worry about attacks on the Italian border was a problem. On the political side, they would also lose what they hoped would be a valuable negotiating avenue, with both the British and the French hoping that the Italians and Mussolini could act as an arbiter between the Western Allies and Hitler. But of a more immediate concern were the troops along the border. When the war started, there were around 550,000 French soldiers along the Italian border, manning the defenses that had been created in the Alps during the interwar years. However, by the time that the Italians attacked, the raw number of those forces had been heavily reduced to kind of meet requirements elsewhere. This meant that the number was down to about 185,000 when war was declared. The good news is that many of the defenses along the southern reaches of the Maginot Line were some of its strongest and most modern, but they would not be the first areas where the two sides would begin their fighting, and instead it would be in the air and at sea where they would first exchange blows. Almost immediately after the war was declared, on the morning of June 11th, a flight of Italian bombers would bomb French targets in Tunisia. Then, on the night of June 12th, 8 Italian bombers would launch a raid against the French naval base at Toulon. This attack was then met by a French attack, although one that was at sea, because on the night of June 13th, a French naval squadron of 4 heavy cruisers and 11 destroyers would conduct a bombardment of Genoa. The bombardment would only last a few minutes in the early hours of June 14th, but during that time they would be able to drop 500 8-inch shells and over 1,000 smaller shells onto a few industrial targets. Now, this raid did not cause a lot of damage. It was mostly symbolic in nature, with the French Navy wanting to prove that it could strike a blow against the Italians, especially with it appearing that an armistice might be signed in the near future. The Royal Air Force would also launch some raids against Italy, with a dozen Wellington bombers moving to airfields near Marseille and launching 2 raids after Toulon was bombed by the Italians. These raids, again against industrial targets in northern Italy, were more symbolic in nature, and after the 2 raids, the entire operation ended and the RAF bombers were moved elsewhere. All of this raiding, both in the air and at sea, was fine, but what Mussolini needed his army to do, what he really needed them to do, was attack and take territory. Because after Paris fell, and it appeared that the war might be over within a few days, it became even more urgent for the Italians to capture territory. Reaching the point of panic that the war would be over before his armies did anything, on June 15th, Mussolini gave Army Group West a 3-day deadline to launch an offensive. The need to launch an offensive gained greater urgency during a meeting between Hitler and Mussolini on June 18th, when Mussolini's demands for French territory, primarily around Nice, the island of Corsica, and then territory in Tunisia, were straight up denied by Hitler, who told Mussolini the only territory that Italy had any chance of being awarded were those that they were in possession of when the armistice negotiations began. The soldiers and commanders of Army Group West did have one hope, and that's that when Pétain sent out his radio broadcast on June 17th, which we'll talk about in a few episodes, for the French to stop fighting, it was hoped that the defenders of the French defenses in the Alps would begin to kind of back away from the Italian border, to begin a peremptory retreat. But Mussolini and the Italian military would not be so lucky. Instead, when the Italian forces began their attack just after 5 a.m. on June 21st, they found advancing too far from the border to be basically impossible. In many areas, they would advance only a few kilometers between the start of the offensive on the 21st and the signing of the armistice on June 24th. During these days of fighting, they would certainly be fierce, but in many cases, entire Italian divisions, would be held up by small French units that were manning their prepared defensive lines. Due to the terrain, this was the Alps after all, there was no real option in a lot of cases to outflank or outmaneuver, and instead the poorly equipped Italians could only throw themselves at the French, a tactic that would prove to be quite unproductive. There were some successes along the front, with a few French villages and towns occupied by Italian forces that were able to either push through them or kind of quickly bypass a couple of the French positions and get between them and behind them to capture a few villages. The French would still be resisting quite strongly against the Italian attacks when the armistice went into effect and the positions generally kind of froze in place. But unfortunately for Mussolini's dreams and aspirations, the Italian territorial goals were generally not fulfilled during the negotiations with France, and instead they would be almost completely removed by Hitler, who just wanted the French to stop fighting and cared very little for what the Italians wanted, and what both he and the French felt that they did not earn. And so really, all that the fighting that the Italians did against the French during the middle of June 1940, all it really accomplished was to bring it into a war with the British Empire. And that was going to be a major problem for the Italians over the next 3.5 to 4 years. But we'll be talking about that a lot on the podcast in the future. It's basically the entire story of the Mediterranean theater of the war. That long story begins with these attacks into France and attacks against the French defenses of the Maginot Line along the Italian border. Those defenses did quite well. In next episode, we will cover the fighting along the rest of the Maginot Line, which had been mostly bypassed when the Germans had attacked through Belgium and the Ardennes, but they did attack it enough that I think it might be informative about how it would have went if they would have attacked in other places. And it also gives me a chance to defend the concept of the Maginot Line. And anybody who's listened to episode 61 of the podcast knows I really like defending the concept of the Maginot Line.